Hello and welcome to Articulate Studies of Religion, Australian Religion in Social Context, Census Data, Land Rights and the Constitution. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing support and connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you're on and pay respects to their elders, past, present and future. As we share our knowledge today, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay our respects to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So, just getting started. This is what our program would look like for today. So I'll do a bit of a brief introduction and housekeeping on how the webinar will run. And then Dr. Christopher Hartney will do the part 1, Religion in Australia after 1945. And then Dr. Tara Smith will do part 2, a case study, Theosophy and 2GB radio. And then we'll have like a very quick chat about studies in religion as a discipline within the university. And then we'll have a Q&A and evaluations. So a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A function on Zoom, and then they will be answered by our academics at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded today, and it will be sent to everyone who has registered via email after the event. It's also going to be added on our Articulate webpage, and you will be able to access it at any point moving forward. And then if you have any questions about the presentation today, feel free to email us at fast.partnerships@sydneyedu.au. And then off to our wonderful speakers. So Dr. Christopher Hartney and Dr. Tara Smith will be talking to us today about studies of religion in high school. So Dr. Christopher Hartney, off to you.
Thank you very much. And could I thank Joyce and Charlotte and Tara for being essential to setting this up. Thank you very much. You might already know me. I'm the author of the Cambridge textbook, Studies in Religion for Stage 6. I do all of the scholarly stuff, and my co-author, John Noble, does a lot of the strategy for how to answer questions and how to focus on ways of getting maximum marks. So between the two of us, we do a reasonably good job at keeping the textbooks for this unit at a really good level, and Cambridge have been very good with helping us do that. What I wanted to talk about today is to focus on religion since 1945 and some of the ways that we can think about it. So my purpose today is not to simply download some knowledge to you, but to get you thinking through various lenses about how we can approach religion and how you can be careful when you do answer your big question at the end of year 12 through a certain number of lenses. So these lenses could be, and I'll give you some examples of this as I go through my talk, an historical lens. So how do we line facts up chronologically and analyze them? A sociological lens, that is, what is the function of religion in a society, certainly in Australia after 1945, through the lens of indigenous studies, which I want to try and convince you can be quite different from looking at things historically or looking at things sociologically. I then want to wrap up by looking at statistics and looking at how we can talk about religion in Australia through a statistical lens. And finally, look at how we can approach things through a legal lens as well. I want to remind you that this was the Royal Easter Show in 1935. And although there are quite a few brunettes there and not so many blondes as one should expect, you can see that the makeup of Australia in 1935 was very white and very focused on, you know, bland English treats such as Cadbury's and so forth. The problem with Australia is that back in the 19th century, various states had various ways of immigration processes. It meant then that even though Chinese people or Indian people or Eastern Europeans might not be allowed into Queensland, They might be able to come into New South Wales, or they might have been able to get into Victoria and then just walk across the border. Australia wasn't a federation. In 1901, we became a Commonwealth. We had a nationwide constitution. And one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed by the new federal parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which was then upgraded in 1902 to basically ensure that nobody of a particular skin color was able to get into the country. How did they work out what your skin color was? They literally compared your skin as you made an application to come into Australia to a brown paper bag. And these brown paper bags were used by the customs officials to bring their lunch in every day. If you were lighter than the bag, you had a much better chance. If you were darker than the bag, you had no chance at all. So from 1901 through to 1945, Australia had a policy of racist-based homogenisation, and that was to ensure that Australia was as white as it possibly could be. And where do indigenous people fit into this system? The answer is legally they don't fit in at all. Legally, they're not even acknowledged as human beings until we get to 1967. I like to set up some things in my brain that will help me remember things historically. And sometimes it's easiest to do that when you look at personalities. And here is one of the big personalities of this change. And here we're looking at Arthur Caldwell. He was very Catholic. He was very much a part of the Labor Party. And he was the first Australian Minister for Immigration. And he served in that role from the end of World War II in 1945 through until 1949, when his government lost at the polls. As immigration minister, he was responding to a whole range of experts who were saying that Australia is too big and it has too little a population. So Caldwell started a project which was later on carried on by the Menzies government and subsequent federal governments to bring in new Australians. And these new Australians couldn't simply come from Ireland, Scotland, and England anymore. In order to find 1 million people, the federal government had to cast its net much more broadly. And in doing that, we had a very significant uptick in people who had been dislocated from their homeland during World War II. And those 1 million people made Australia look different and moved Australia towards not assimilation and whiteness, but towards diversity and multiculturalism, the sort of Australia that we know today. As a consequence of that project, Australia rose in population from 8 million up towards the 25 approximate million that it is today. But the suburbs began to look differently. And here's an example of how things started to look differently. From a very sedate Christianity, here we have a picture of St. Anastasios's church. It's a Greek Orthodox church. Where is it? In Sydney, it's in Rookwood Cemetery. So here's something that Christian churches tended to have their own cemetery, but the whole idea that you would build a church inside a cemetery was not exactly novel, but something that is unique in the connection that Greek Australians have to this part of Rookwood, where one goes and visits graves on a very regular basis, and one goes to church inside the cemetery. This is the most popular part of Rookwood Cemetery out near Lidcombe in the western suburbs of Sydney. And here you can see parishioners carrying an epitafio, which is a bier representing the coffin of Jesus Christ. So this is at Easter, and here parishioners are carrying the body of Jesus into the church on Good Friday, and then of course on Easter Sunday, the coffin will be revealed to be empty, and everybody will ecstatically chant that Christ is risen, that the resurrection has taken place, which is at the heart of so many Christian Easter services, but it's made even more palpably celebratory, as you can see it here in this Greek Orthodox church. So here's more of what that difference begins to look at, and I've picked this other decade from 1973 to 1983. I was alive at this time, and growing up in Bankstown, I saw the suburbs change radically around me, and those staid brick churches of the Presbyterians and the Scots and the Anglicans or the English or the Catholics more generally, we got this great diversity erupting all the way from the incredible, you can see it from the railway line as you go past Auburn railway station. The Gallipoli Mosque at Auburn is an incredible example of Turkish architectural style. And this is partly because these changes partly happen because of incredible crises that happen around the world, from the unification of Vietnam on the 30th of April 1975, where a lot of people in the South were not communists, but they were overtaken. The country was reunified by the communists, and they felt they needed to leave. Between 1975 and 1983. We had in 1975 a significant war in Lebanon. So we had the arrival of Lebanese Muslims and Lebanese Christian refugees arriving. 1983, we had the eruption of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and that brought out more Buddhists and also a great many Hindus. So there was radical changes in the makeup of particularly the western suburbs of Sydney and the outer suburbs of Melbourne. And over here, of course, on the other side is a religion that I have spent a lot of my time studying, and it's a new religion from Vietnam called Caodaism. And if you live in or around Wally Park and you go up and down King George's Road, you will see this building. It's a building that represents Catholicism and Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism all put together into a great new sort of representation of multiculturalism as a faith system. So these buildings have visitors programs, and of course you're welcome to go and visit them as well. But the base point is Australia simply looked different and had a diversity to it that was quite substantially noticeable, with tensions caused as well. Local white neighbours would say, well, not enough parking. We can't have these buildings in our area. Absolutely not enough parking, but thankfully councils prevailed and these incredible buildings began to go up, and Australia began to have a new idea of the diversification of its religious nature, even though it somehow essentially that nation was maybe Christian, maybe Catholic, maybe at least nominally connected to a Western religious tradition. We nevertheless see the whole world arriving in Sydney, particularly during this decade, and the sense of religion feeling different. So now I want to shift you from that historical development that I just spoke about to a sociological development. And for sociologists, I think they would all recognize that one of the great founding documents in the study of religion from a sociological perspective, or from the perspective of how societies work, is this book by Emil Durkheim, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Durkheim wrote this in 1917. It took a long while for it to flow through into the academy, but I think a lot of sociologists would say that his definition of religion is a very functional and clever definition. So that for Durkheim, if he happened to walk into a Catholic church and look at the sacred things up near the altar, and look at the cross above the altar, and maybe the statue of a crucified Jesus on the cross, he wouldn't see these things as representing heaven. He wouldn't see these things as representing an access to a paradise or to another world. He would see these sacred things as totemic of the unity of the group. So how do Catholics hold themselves together in a congregation? Well, they hold central and sacred the cross, the crucifix, the Bible, the Pope, the Vatican, the authority that flows down from the chair of St. Peter's. All of these things are sacred to Catholics, not necessarily because they indicate a connection to another world or another heaven, but sociologically because they hold the community together. Everybody in a Catholic community agrees that those things are ultimately concerning to them, that they're essentially important. So this is the sociological mechanism that we have that takes us away from an older definition of religion, which is a religion that must have a supreme being and it must have a code of morals and ethics. It does indeed need this, but Durkheim shows that these things are just ways of keeping societies working really tightly together. While Durkheim's becoming more and more central to our understanding of religion throughout the 20th century, something else very radically happened. I've got a passport, a British passport here, except that this is not a British passport. This is an Australian passport. And if you went and asked for a passport, all the way up until 1967, you would be given one of these, that Australians travelling internationally would travel on a British passport. Legislation in 1948 really codifies the idea of Australian citizenship for the first time. Before that, we're a part of the British Empire, and those white members of Australian society are British citizens. After 1967, you can actually get yourself, for the first time, an Australian passport. So we have a shift from 48 to 67, from those things which are sacred to us and are our ultimate concerns, being Britain, the monarchy, the British Empire, and our whiteness. And subsequent to 1967, we start to come into a new consciousness of who we are as Australians, and that is people united on this continent island, all together and looking to great and important Australian things as being sacred to us as a nation. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show you the most sacred building in Australia, but before that, I have a question for you. We have a Mentimeter QR code here, which I encourage you to click on. When you do, it's going to ask you this question: what is your ultimate concern? That is, what is the thing that is most important to you? So please do this. Please click on the QR code and send in your response. And while you're doing that, I'll make some suggestions. When I ask this question of first years, it's very interesting that some of them will say, well, you know, I'm a Christian, therefore God is my ultimate concern. Some people will say, well, my family is. Yes, family's coming up. A roof over your head, the need for money, the need for security, the whole idea of world peace, the fact that maybe everybody on earth should be fed correctly and housed correctly, that there should be no more war. And of course, some people say, and it's quite valid to say this, some people say that their ultimate concern is South Sydney Rugby League's team, which some people in my family would say that. But it's interesting to think about what you think your ultimate concern would be, because when we get into the legal examination of what religion is in Australia, we will see that indeed that's something that comes in. That's a great response there. Thank you guys for giving some of those responses. They're all valid, and they're all sorts of things that people would talk about as their ultimate concern. So this, I think, is the most sacred building in Australia because it is a building of national sacrality, and it is the Hall of Memory in the Australian War Memorial, which we'll find on Mount Ainslie in Canberra. And is it the case that Anzac is our state religion? And is it the case that if Anzac is our state religion, then is war remembrance and the memory of those who made sacrifices for our nation overseas and who martyred themselves so that Australia could stand proud among the nations of the earth, does that make this an extremely, perhaps the most religious building in Australia? And you can see that there is a tomb of an unknown soldier on the ground. You can see the roof or the dome there is like a rising up of angels into heaven, and you've got stained glass windows representing a whole range of servicemen and women who contributed to, as it were, the salvation of Australia. Now, you might think that's a little bit of a controversial statement, and many people would, but this is something that I've been writing about for quite a while, that in fact, it is the Anzac cult, the cult of the dead soldier, as it were, in Australia, that is essential to Australianness. It is so sacred, you might say, and it is so white, because that building was opened in 1943 when Australia still thought of itself as a very white nation. All of the statues in that building, bar a couple of decorations on the sandstone, are of white people. All of the names in there are of white people. So it's very interesting then that there are two war memorials in Canberra of high importance. The first one is the big sandstone one with all of the white names on it. The second one is a small memorial out the back of that building further up Mount Ainslie, which has been built by Indigenous servicemen. And so here are 3 Indigenous Australians who are standing at that memorial and remembering members of their Indigenous Australian families who served and who died for Australia as well, but who tend to get lost or their names get disappeared in the history of Australian war. What I'd like to do now is just briefly take you through the sacrality of Indigenous religions in Australia, but I want to do this by changing the paradigm again. We've had history, we've had sociology. Now I want you to think about the issue of Indigenous studies. Indigenous studies is different to history because history is in Australia often written by white people. So Indigenous studies is about you going out and finding sources and voices that are spoken by Indigenous people about their religious tradition. And you have to acknowledge, as we see here in this slide, that knowledge is a restricted thing. As somebody who's not initiated, you're allowed to know some knowledge, but you're not allowed to know all knowledge. And this is quite different from history and sociology, where scholars try to study absolutely everything. This is something that is much more nuanced. This is a piece of art by Clifford Possum called Honey Ant Dreaming. Here is, and it's from an art appreciation website, but it tells you the story, the dreaming story behind that piece of art. When you get these slides, I hope you get a chance to read this dreaming story. I think the next slide also is from a different website that includes this dreaming story as well, Better World Arts, trying to explain that painting I just showed you before. But what you find with the dreaming story is a very interesting pattern. Pattern 1, there is the land. Pattern 2, ancestral spirits come onto the land and change it. Part 3, there is a knowledge that is generated about how those ancestral people changed the landscape. And part 4, you may be able to access that knowledge if you are in the right social group. Now, that knowledge is very important because it is a passport to the land. It shows you where the sacred parts are and where the not sacred parts are. The story might include information about water holes, where food can be sourced, directions to the next water hole. These dreaming manifestations or narrations can tell you so much about how to use the land. It means then that when we look at religion through the paradigm of Indigenous studies, we have to be very aware of the fact that the religious-y bit of the story can't easily be separated from the rest of the story, which is about land use, understanding land features, and understanding what went on in this different time period where the ancestors transformed and changed that land. So I just want to stress that Indigenous studies is about you being aware and also letting the readers of your answers aware, if you're writing on Indigenous studies, of the fact that you know about the difficulties and the gateways and the fact that you can't know everything when you're talking about Indigenous issues. As a consequence, your reader of your final responses, if you're writing about Indigenous studies, are going to be asking questions like, are you showing respect and awareness and carefulness when it comes to writing about religion from an Indigenous studies perspective? I also want to point out that there are areas in Australia where traditional stories are being told, and there are areas in Australia where people are being taken away from country, and so they don't have access to land and stories in the way that some Indigenous people still do. And you have to acknowledge this also when you're taking on Indigenous studies as a prism through which to study some of these things. So also be mindful of the fact that knowledge that comes to you on Indigenous religious systems is a disrupted knowledge. Things, lines of transmission have been broken, and we have to be very aware that we can't write with an overwhelming certainty about how things worked, because we simply need to understand that colonization has disrupted many stories and has caused a problem that we have to acknowledge when we're writing about these issues. This is the second last paradigm, and it's about religion and legality. Again, when we get up to 1982, 1983, it was assumed that all religions in Australia were somehow Christian. And because of this, there was a dispute between Scientology and the Victorian government about whether Scientology was a religion. Scientology took the Victorian government to the High Court of Australia in 1982, 1983, and there the High Court judges have to give a legal definition of what is a religion. And you can see the definition there in the second last point. It has to be groups of people who call themselves religious, constitute the religious, people who have a belief in a thing or a supernatural being and have a moral or ethical code that gives effect to that belief. There's a quote there from a very interesting paper that was written at the University of Technology, Sydney, that goes further into that decision. And I encourage you all to have a look at that. It's a great resource. Final slide from me is, how can we think about things statistically? And we need, of course, to be very aware that statistics don't give us the full story. But when we go through the censuses that are made every 5 years, we see that Christianity slows in its development. We see that Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism in particular, Hinduism in very much particular, grows and develops. And this says something very interesting about what Australia is about to become. And this gives me a very great opportunity to now segue over to Tara Smith, who's going to keep talking about statistics and take you on a journey into the Theosophical Society. Thank you, Tara.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Chris, for that very, very interesting start of the presentation. So I know we've already been introduced, but my name is Dr. Tara Smith, and I'm an early career academic at the University of Sydney. So first in my section, I'm going to introduce some questions and ideas about the 2021 census data, and then I'll explore religious diversity through a case study of the Theosophical Society in Australia. And finally, I'll end up talking about lizard people. So let's see how we are going to get there. But before we move on, I want to ask everybody, what do you find the most interesting thing about religion? And it's okay to say nothing, but I'm hoping at the end of this presentation, you're going to have some good sort of thoughts and ideas. So if you guys can all use the QR code, if you probably worked out by now, you use your phone and you hold it there, and if you press the middle of the screen, it will take you. And I want you to kind of answer this question. What do you find most interesting? Maybe you're like Chris, and maybe you love to explore religion in sort of technically, or what people consider secular spaces, or maybe you're like me and you like new religious movements and the kind of more wacky kind of ideas. So let's see what everybody's coming up with. All right, so that's our ultimate concern. And let's see what we think most interesting about religion. Don't be shy about sharing your ideas. Purpose, here we go. So you find the purpose interesting, the supernatural, exploring different perspectives, sexual ethics. I think that's a really fascinating area, something I'm quite interested in as well. Bioethics, I think that's meant to be, or bioethics, maybe that's a new field that I'm not aware of. What else have we got there? Oh, they're coming in. Understandings of God, new religious experience. Wow, you guys are a great amount of like diversity of ideas. This is awesome. I'm gonna sort of write some of these down and come back to them later. This is really, really interesting. So thank you for sharing that. So Chris has already touched a little on census data and things like sort of talking very briefly about different religions in Australia. And I think the census data is a really good way to understand the sort of trends and changes that have sort of happened over the years. But it's also, as Chris mentioned, can really be quite limited in many ways and doesn't often sort of give voice to the diversity of religious belief in Australia. So if you have a look at this graph, you'll see sort of three lines. You see a sort of light blue line, which is representing Christianity. You can see that it's in quite a bit of decline. You also see a dark blue line, which is other religions sort of increasing. And then you see the really quite stark rise of the sort of no religion element. And sort of looking at this sort of trend, you might sort of have this idea that sort of prior or 1971, there was basically no religious diversity. And then we sort of start to get to today and there's so much more diversity. But I'm going to try and argue that this isn't the complete picture and that there was still quite a lot of religious diversity and, new religious movements, spiritualism and things like that prior. So I'm going to be talking about sort of theosophy. So first I'm going to introduce you to some people. This is my mum in the middle. So she was a theosophist for a really long time in Australia, in specifically the esoteric branch. And she traveled to India, spent a lot of time in Adia, and she's no longer a member now, but this sort of, I guess, sparked my interest in theosophy as a religion and Radio 2GB. And so I'm just going to quickly provide a very brief introduction of who and what theosophy is, if you're not familiar with it. So the Theosophical Society, or TS, was founded in 1875 in New York, and it's been sort of present in Australia since 1985. And it has three main objectives: to form a nexus of universal humanity, independent of race, creed, sex, caste, or colour, and to encourage the study of comparative religion, and finally explore the laws of nature and the sort of essence within each person. In the 1920s, Australia, they had quite the presence in Sydney. In 1923, they built a giant amphitheatre in Balmoral Beach, complete with sort of Doric columns. You can see a picture here. I was lucky enough to spend some time with the residents of the Manor, which is another large theosophical building in Mossman, and see sort of some archival pictures and images. And this is an example of that. And this is called the Star Amphitheatre. And some of you might recognize, if you're from Sydney, some of the headlands sort of in the background there. This amphitheatre was built in preparation for Jiddu Krishnamurti, the arrival, who was an Indian boy who was brought into the TS and was sort of waited upon as this amazing master of ancient wisdom that hoped to sort of oversee the evolution of humankind, reincarnated from famous religious masters like Christ and Krishna over the years. And Krishnamurti, much to this sort of disappointment to the Theosophical Society, really rejected this role and basically dissolved the star that had built this wonderful amphitheatre for him, and decided that he was going to kind of leave all religion behind and wanted to set man free from all cages, including religion, sex, and philosophies. So unfortunately, coming back to the amphitheatre, after many wonderful performances, plays and acts, it was actually sold and demolished in 1951, and now it's a large block of 30 flats. And personally, I would love to have seen the amphitheatre in action, but it is no more. But I want to talk a bit about another sort of major kind of creation by the TS, and that is the Radio 2GB. I reckon most of you probably have heard of Radio 2GB because it's still very alive today, but it is very different to how it started. And don't worry, I'm not trying to say that Ben Fordham or Ray Hadley are secret theosophists. They are. They might be, but I'm not sure. But before 2GB was the sort of commercial radio we all know and maybe love or hate, it was owned by the TS and broadcast radio shows from the Manor. In the 1920s and well into the sort of 1930s. I think even after that, there were some shows that they would produce. And GB actually stands for Giordano Bruno, who some of you might recognize as quite a famous Italian philosopher and occultist. So that's a bit of pub trivia that I probably won't come up, but it's good for you to know. So for the academic row, World War I quickened the sort of pace of the Australian Theosophical movement, which would really climb a climax in the 1920s. So post-war reconstruction would combine with sort of messianic urges, creating a sort of masculine and millennial tone in theosophy at the time. And the literature of this period reflects a new desire amongst theosophists to harness the sort of Anzac and Australian spirit. In the Theosophical Convention in 1924, the slogan "Theosophize Australia" was used to define the idea of sort of doubling membership, increasing the funds available to the society, and improving the nation. So at this time, the TS offered Australia and sort of an alternative to the mainstream and promoted art and culture, as well as new ideas on politics, spirituality, and philosophy. So the radio was really this sort of avenue to try and bring more Australians into theosophy. And when established, 2GB was considered an impressive feat of engineering and had one of the most powerful transmitters in the Southern Hemisphere at the time, and really broadcast regular programs. And there was even people in America at the time that could hear snippets of it, which is really quite amazing. So a typical broadcasting program, and this was one that I found that was released in 1926, which I believe was their first broadcast, sort of sets out a typical TS agenda. So at 10:30 on a Sunday, while you're sort of sipping your coffee, you could catch the morning service from St. Albans Church in Redfern. During the week in the evening, if you have children or maybe siblings, they could listen to the children's talk from the man from Dreamland. And then later in that evening, on that same day, you could sort of listen to special talks from the constructionist engineer himself, and sort of hear E.G. talk about that sort of radio more in general. And on Wednesday, there was a special talk just for women. In this first speech sort of delivered by the radio, Bishop Arundel stated that the goal of the station was to broadcast brotherhood wherever the friendly air will take it, and that the station itself has no politics, no creed, no dogmas, and no doctrines. But political talks, religion talks, talks on Australia's problems and questions will be heartily welcomed. So separate from the station's own ideas, we can sort of see also in the Trove archives, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Trove, but it's an online sort of depository that has a lot of different historical newspapers and magazines. And in the Trove, I found a lot of sort of snippets from around this time. You can see from the Armidale Chronicle from 1926, there was a clerk from Perth that confirmed that they had heard Reverend Hammond all the way from Sydney giving his sermons. And a missionary from Lachlan River also reported hearing the Sunday service. In Lismore from 1926, a fan wrote in and just talked about how much they love the diversity and quality of the station. So the topics and stories broadcast by 2GB allowed for a diverse range of voices in a relatively kind of culturally and stagnant sort of atmosphere. And tuning in, listeners might hear a story on gardening, they might hear concerts from Adia Hall, or talks advocating for the rights of disenfranchised Australians. There were also telepathic tests by Harold Morton, lectures by prominent theosophers like Miss Clara Codd on happiness and philosophy, talks on psychic phenomena where listeners were urged to call in and join the discussion, and even instances when listeners would be invited to contribute to surveys on the nature of reincarnation. So these examples of such a range of formats and topics reveal not only the alternative discourses of the station, but also the station's national reach. And it really sort of critiques this idea, I think, that it was some sort of like, no, there wasn't much religious diversity prior to this time period, because there really was, especially this sort of New Age theosophical movement. So 2GB was the sixth sort of Sydney station and promoted culture, religious pluralism, classicalism, and as it likes to sort of say, good music. That's a quote from the radio station, respectful political debate, and a platform for female voices and explorations into science, philosophy, and alternate spiritualities. So sort of like thinking about all of that we've talked today, and we've sort of already touched on aspects of this, I want you to kind of think about this idea of what religion means. And this is a key kind of question that Chris and I and other people in this discipline are really asking. Maybe you think of it similar to the sort of socialist approach, this sort of ultimate concern, or I want you to kind of try and come up with a definition of religion in like 30 seconds. And it's a big ask, but just see what you can come up with. So what does religion mean to you? Maybe, you could be looking at this from a sociological perspective, an ultimate concern perspective. Are you drawing from Durkheim? Maybe are we looking from the religion from within or religion from without? Do you believe that religion should be decided by the religious group, or do you think it should be an outside sort of parameter? There's so many different sort of ways. If we can't get it to work, maybe what I'll do is I'll keep talking and we'll come back and see what kind of answers that we've kind of gone to. I'm sort of kind of guessing what the sort of answers will be is that it's going to be a real diversity of different approaches. And this is to sort of highlight the real difference in defining religion, and that it's not a kind of clear-cut definition. For example, so from all the themes of the sort of Theosophical Society that we've explored, and returning back to the census data. So if you're having a look at this one here, this picture here, if you were a Theosophist, where would you sort of position yourself when you're filling in the census data? Because technically you could more or less tick each and every one of these boxes. You could say that you were an atheist, because you don't have to be any religious particular religion to be a theosophist. You could say you're agnostic. You could say you have your own spiritual beliefs, other spiritual beliefs, theism, multi-faith, humanism is a huge factor. So there's so many different elements. And of course you could, click other and write that you're a theosophist. But I'm trying to sort of say that the sort of census data doesn't really give us a wealth of knowledge. You could also be multiple. You could be a theosophist, but also identify as a Christian. So what would you put there as the census data if you can't put both? So this is the sort of question I want you to think about. So if we see sort of religion as a greater concern or a way of life, which is some of the kind of approach that we have, where do conspiracy theories sort of fit within this? Defining a conspiracy theory as a sort of contested activity, both due to the nature of the subject matter, and this is similar to our definition of religion, and the fluidity of the term. Conspiracy theory is often used as a euphemism for various fringe opinions and can be applied to everything from the theories about history and factual events like Watergate or the Kennedy assassination to the more obscure variety that involves extraterrestrial speculation. In the 21st century, conspiracy theories have become more prominent. For Michael Barkin, belief in these conspiracy theories is a key to millennialist worldview that reduces the world into a battle of good and evil or light and darkness. Barkin's tendencies find common roots in David Icke's conspiracy theories, which follow Icke's personal journey as he confronts the suffering he sees in a world that is constructed and controlled by the evil beings. Barkin's definition for a conspiracy theory is one that posits an organization made up of individuals or groups who was or are acting covertly to achieve some malevolent end. As Icke's theories sort of developed over the years, the common theme of a negative oppressor prevailed, concluding with ideas about the reptilian extraterrestrials that control humanity and feed off their negative energy. So most people know that I can rarely give a lecture without at least briefly talking about lizard people. So we now enter the part of the talk about lizard people. But I want to provide a quick disclaimer. I'm not myself a lizard person or a conspiracy theory believer, but I do believe if I was a lizard person, that's exactly what I would tell you. So you have to believe what you want to believe. So if you haven't heard about the Anunnaki or David Icke, that is okay, but here's a quick rundown. David Icke is a white-haired Old English man who is often known as the reptilian guy. David Icke was born in Leicester in 1952 and began his career as a successful football player and became a member of the Greens Party in 1983. It was in 1990 that Icke began his esoteric phase and began to feel an unknown presence within him. And in that same year, with the help of psychic Betty Shine, was able to communicate with this presence, a Chinese ascended master named Wang Yi Li, who made several prophecies and who with other ascended masters would guide him. A theme we've already sort of briefly touched when looking at theosophy. And I would argue that a lot of these sort of new age ideas have really come from the back of movements like theosophy in the early sort of 1920s that have really influenced these new religious movements. So you can see here some sort of snippets here from his books, including that our emotions have a physical manifestation, just as the earth does, and the way we act affects the natural earth. And there's really strong kind of ecological themes throughout David Icke's theories. In his book, The Children of the Matrix, we are told that the best way to free ourselves from reptilian slavery is through the realization of the many overlapping realities that exist within our lives. Icke presents a worldview in which the universe is primarily an energetic existence and everything within the natural world is connected as sort of living nature. And Icke, towards the end of his book, The Biggest Secret, points out that everything is part of a unique vibrational energy field in which all living matter consists of energy, but in different patterns. And I quote here, just as water can manifest as liquid, clouds, steam, and ice. Icke reinforces the energetic nature of the world in And the Truth Shall Set You Free in 2004. Therein, he explains that a person is a series of magnetic energy fields. Soul is a place, an experience, a situation, everything. Life is the interaction of these energy fields. And this energy is connected to everything else, in which there is no us and them, only we and ultimately I. Now, you will see some strong kind of ecological beliefs and Gaia theories and nature religions are very much tied also with these sort of new age belief systems. And I don't have too much to talk about this, but happy to discuss further with the questions. But so now with our religious brain sort of switched on, I bet you can see some very sort of religious beliefs appearing. But normally conspiracy theories like David Icke's isn't considered religion. And this sort of asks more questions of how do we define religion? How do we consider conspiracy theories? And I'm sure a lot of you were aware during, the pandemic, we're seeing QAnon and a lot more kind of, especially in America, movement towards conspiracy theories. And so I think religious studies is such a good paradigm to kind of view these belief systems in a kind of contemporary world in Australia and the world. So if you have, this has kind of piqued your interest into conspiracy theories, you want to learn more about new religious movements, about understanding secular religious sort of practices, secular in quotations, with a sort of religious lens, then I'm here to also ask you to join us in the studies of religion at Sydney University. I believe it's such a kind of interesting field, and it's really important for us to kind of communicate that religion isn't just limited to one particular religion or one particular approach, but there's so many different ways to sort of explore that. I mean, my thesis looked at science fiction and religion, so this is just one way that you can kind of really incorporate really interesting fields. And these are the first 2 units for next year. We've got RLST 1002, which explores sacred texts, stories, morality and worldviews, and then RLST 1005, which looks at atheism, fundamentalism, new religion, and new age. And I imagine that a lot of the sort of themes that the Theosophical Society explores and conspiracy theories will appear in these. And thank you so much, all of you, and I wish you all the best of luck for your future studies, and we hope to see you with us soon. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris and Tara, for your insightful presentation. Before we move on, we have a question in the Q&A that one of the students has sent through, and they're asking, it is not clear for me the relation between conspiracy theories and religion. Can you make it clearer? Over to you, Tara, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think this really brings into what Chris talked about as the ultimate concern. So for people like David Icke and the large amount of people that follow him, this idea of a kind of world view that's controlled by the Illuminati and a kind of dark, sinister force, or these lizard people, is, as I would say, as important to them as somebody that believes in Christianity. And so if we're looking at that as an ultimate concern, I believe that conspiracy theories should be examined under the kind of guise of religious studies. And this is a sort of the broad kind of idea of religion not just being limited to, do you believe in God, yes or no, and that being the kind of only question and parameter for religious studies. So that would be sort of my answer of why conspiracy theories should be incorporated into studies of religion.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If you have any more questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. In the meantime, one of the questions that we do get quite often, and of course it's open to both you, both Chris and Tara, is what are some of the differences about studying of religion in high school and studies in religion at a university, at the University of Sydney?
It'd be nice if I could answer that. Can we cut out of the share screen and
of course,
maybe focus on my beautiful face again? That would be lovely. I was thinking about this question because when you study religion at the HSC level, you've got to follow a very particular line in the curriculum, so that the Board of Studies have set down what is to be studied, and they have units such as religion and peace. And that sort of set me off when I read that, because religion and peace is important, but religion and violence is equally important. So when you come and study religion at Sydney, after studying religion and peace for the HSC, you can study religion and violence at Sydney. And of course, we're here to encourage people to develop their own research projects and to think in their own specific ways. So unfortunately, you and your teachers have to follow the Board of Studies guidelines in terms of what it is that is on the page and needs to be studied. That becomes far more flexible when we get to university level and we want to look into these things. We're usually here to encourage you to follow your enthusiasms, even if they go off the page a little bit. Science fiction and religion is something that Tara came up with that she really wanted to go with, and so we supported her. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have time for one more question, and they're asking to clarify what is the new religious movement.
So this is a really interesting question, and Tara's probably got a better answer than me, but I'm going to just say that probably something that arose at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. So it's kind of got a chronological definition around it, something that's new, something that's innovative, something that people are very concerned about or worried about. New religious movements usually get a lot of hate mail, and they're usually defined by a particular charismatic leader outside the usual structures of institutionalized religion. Would you agree with that, Tara?
Yeah, I think you've covered the main sort of things. I would say that normally you might be more familiar with the term cult. So cult is often used to describe new religious movements, but in studies of religion and the religious studies discipline more generally, we try not to categorize religions as cult because of the sort of negative connotations that are sort of associated with that. You know, language is really important in the way we define things. And so you know, we're kind of moving away from sort of these older paradigms that would see certain religions just because it doesn't agree with the sort of mainstream religious ideas as being deviant or cult or negative. And so that's maybe something people would be more familiar with.
Now, before we wrap up, can I ask a question of everybody in the room? And that is, this is the first time we've done this. We sort of put a call out saying, what do you want us to talk about? We didn't get too many reactions. So if we do that again, we want to know what you want to hear about, and that's going to help you with your studies. So please be really generous with your replies to today's event. And if you want us to speak about something else, we're really happy to try and do that for you and help you through your studies. Thanks for your replies, guys. And it was lovely that you could turn up. And we hope we were a bit of a help, and we wish you all the best for your studies, of course.
Thank you. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So if you want to stay up to date about all the different events and opportunities that we do offer, you can also sign up to our newsletter that is hyperlinked on our webpage, and we will send you out further information about any events or any, like, you know, even for teachers, PD opportunities that are coming up that are kind of looked after by our faculty. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you very much to our presenters as well, and for the time and effort in leading up to this talk and everything that they have prepared for today. We wish everyone a lovely evening ahead, and we hope to see you soon.